I think my favorite false solution within all of this is the idea that technology is going to save us in a material sense. This is the big one with the reigning techno-capitalist apologists out there, the millionaire and billionaire tech class who dominate the media with their ambitious concepts, who certainly, indeed, have no incentive to dismantle the very system that made them so wealthy and powerful, so they just assume science will prevail to continue cleaning up the things as we go along, without addressing the system itself. For example, we just won't worry about the market-incentivized industrial mechanisms that are producing air pollution that kills millions of people each year. Instead, let's just build massive air cleaning machines or other such methods to clean up as we go along once again. The logic that whatever problems capitalism creates will be fixed by some new technology is not only painfully lazy, it's utterly unworkable in the long run. The negative market externalities, as we can summarily categorize them, will just keep multiplying at a rate faster than we can solve them by such patchwork. Again, we have to go after the root causes, needless to say. So, back to my point. Policy attempts have limited effects by default, and that doesn't just apply to ecological problems, but also to social problems in the form of poverty, crime, hierarchical power abuse, corruption, and the like. And in many contexts, policy evolves then into institutions, regulatory institutions, interventionist institutions as well. Same idea. The Environmental Protection Agency, for example. The general institution of mass incarceration as an outcome of the legal system. And in some cases, you will even have seemingly activist uprisings that attempt creative destruction of existing institutions by attempting their own institutional development. On that context, I must say my current favorite example of this false solution of institutional change is the hilarious pop culture fascination with cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. While most people in this arena are just gambling in the context of Wall Street, there is a substantial subculture, shockingly, that thinks somehow the rise of cryptocurrency will forge an institutional transformation of the financial system for the better. Unfortunately, this is not going to be the case, as much as the financial system needs reform. Again, just like policy, institutions are fundamentally subservient to the system they are born from. Bitcoin is no different, and is just a system modulation that ultimately challenges nothing in terms of the fundamental flaws of the financial and banking institution realm, resting, in fact, on a grand delusion and mythology, largely rooted in old libertarian ideas around so-called sound money. Please understand, it doesn't matter how sound you think money is or could be in whatever form, as long as it exists as part of the larger order market system, there will never be much of a difference in core outcomes for public health and society. For example, the persistence of inflation and debt. I have long been a critic of the fiat system and have described its basis in debt as a form of slavery, which is precisely the function it serves. But even if you were able to design a currency that wasn't built upon debt on the government level, meaning the elimination of central banks, debt would still be present through the loan structure of commercial banks or whatever institutional variation arises to replace it. Even if all currency in the world were replaced by cryptocurrency, being peer-to-peer, decentralized, the same structure would still materialize to distribute that currency to people that don't have it, as per the inherent income imbalance generated by market trade. The same market trade that would also incentivize fees for those loan transactions, which would serve the same role as, yes, interest charges. And boom, the debt-based indentured servitude society persists. And I mean that as a broad distinction. It doesn't have to pertain to cryptocurrency. But let's get to inflation. What's missing in that conversation is understanding the system adaptation, as simplicity has moved to complexity over the past 100 years. Bitcoin is designed to only produce 21 million coins, and it's argued that this scarcity reduces inflationary risk. This is merely a variation of the utility of a gold standard or precious metals backing a currency from hundreds of years ago. The point people don't ask when they reflect on why we don't use a fixed money supply or backing anymore, moving into the realm of near infinite fiat, has to do with the total system evolution as it continues to evolve from simplicity to complexity. Modern capitalism today cannot function with a fixed money supply. It is too inflexible to compensate for the extreme imbalances constantly created in the modern global system. It doesn't matter how much you subdivide a single Bitcoin. It comes down to the value of the total supply, the total Bitcoin supply in this case. The moment immediate monetary needs of society exceed that value, the entire society locks up. In the fiat system, value can be created out of thin air based on need and regionally so. Yes, there are huge problems with the fiat system, but the fiat system is consequential of the larger order market economy and the system-level imbalances it creates. A fixed money supply, no matter how vast, is a recipe for disaster in such a complex economic architecture. There will be massive crises that will still happen because of the very nature of market economics itself, having nothing to do with the nature of currency itself, and those crises will have to be met with mass liquidity injections of values, monetary values, that can meet those needs, addressed regionally in virtually all cases. Therefore, coming back to the phenomenon of inflation, this is just what the total system has to do in its current adaptive form. If you don't believe that, just model it with modern statistics. Imagine an island with X number of people. They create a fixed money supply with a given value. You mirror the velocity dynamics of the real world, meaning how the rate of exchange, how fast things are changing hands, and then start unbalancing the system in terms of wealth and income disparity, as is endogenously consistent by mass market trade. And over time, you're going to see that the money supply gets sucked up by fewer and fewer people, along with cyclical major crises that will occur, and that society will come to a halt if new monetary value isn't introduced out of thin air. It is inevitable. In the end, the cryptocurrency sphere is a huge waste of time and energy from a social change perspective. And I hope people who have been sucked into this delusion begin to understand that. If you're into gambling, go ahead. Take other people's fiat money, as quite ironically, the very value of each crypto coin is literally derived from fiat currency. And if you want to use it to send money peer-to-peer without a third-party institution, cool. Some countries can very much benefit from that as well, along with using it as a hedge against domestic currency problems, or perhaps even having utility as an alternative to foreign currency reserves and other things that are discussed. So there is use, there is utility out there. And again, I'm all in favor of peer-to-peer decentralization, as I'll talk about more so as we go along. But please, please stop the nonsense, distraction, that this marks some new path toward revolutionary change. It doesn't. So in the end, all of this Bitcoin and crypto delusion has really done is cause great damage to the activist community through distraction. And it's rather grotesque to see propagandists promote it in this way, as a grand solution, when all they're really doing is trying to get other people to buy it, so the price will continue to rise for the sake of the propagandists' wealth that already own it. In fact, as an investment or gambling asset, which is likely all it will ever be, Bitcoin is arguably the most idealized Ponzi asset ever conceived of, as the perceived utility is absent of everything but conjecture, and its foundational scarcity can only push the idea of the price rising. And that's why it's so popular as the mass delusion it is. Unlike stocks, which symbolize the behavior of an existing company, crypto has no fundamental relationship to anything but the vast subjective assumptions of its purpose, coupled with its contrived scarcity once again. It's really quite fascinating and quite depressing as well. In fact, the whole phenomenon can be summarized with an old Woody Allen joke. A guy walks into a psychiatrist's office and says to the doctor, "Hey, my sister thinks she's a chicken." And the doctor says, "Well, you should bring her in. We'll try to fix this." And he says, "No, I can't. You see, we need the eggs." Now, before we move on, I'd like to say one more thing on the issue of false solutions and bad assumptions. The ever-pervasive idea that your individual ethical actions are going to carve out a better world, irrespective of the existing social system. The implication of this thinking is that the economic system is neutral or malleable by way of unorchestrated intention. You know, ideas such as voting with your dollar, buying ethically sourced this or that, riding your bike to work to avoid hydrocarbon use, and so forth. The idea being that as long as you, as an individual, have proper moral compass, and if we all have proper moral compass, whatever that means, everything will work out, regardless of the pre-existing system you are inside of. No. Such behaviors should be encouraged, of course, but they are not functional towards system change for a few reasons. First is the subjective nature of what morality is supposed to be within the current culture. Where does a culture derive its sense of ethical responsibility? It's not the scope of this podcast to go into such philosophical analysis, but what we can agree upon is that morality and ethics are a cultural phenomenon, begging the question, where does the culture come from? It comes primarily from the system of survival and the social relations inherent to it. And as far as I'm concerned, a truly moral person wouldn't just be concerned about overt abuses, such as the fact that there are more slaves in the world than any time in history, in human history, according to United Nations standards, but also the very incorporation of human exploitation itself, which defines the very essence of market capitalism. The extraction of surplus value, to use a technical term. You can only generate profit through imbalance, such as seeking cost efficiency, which is often rooted in the exploitation of a desperate human being for labor power. Most are drawing arbitrary lines when it comes to what they think is morally appropriate or not, and that is consequential to the social system itself, which determines the overall moral aptitude of society, what we call normal. Similarly, we can directly see what the socioeconomic system is incentivizing and rewarding and realize that the average person is going to go with that flow for their basic day-to-day survival. From a person who must save money due to income scarcity, that does not have the luxury of supporting businesses that may be doing things a little bit more humanely, a little bit more ethically, a little bit better in terms of production and sustainability, to the general business mindset required to stay profitable, which is fundamentally competitive. Meaning, if you run a business with truly sustainable practices, the costs incurred will force you to lose your competitive edge and lose money in the long run. That's why unsustainable practices prevail, because it's too expensive to do things properly as you compete. And a common cliche retort to that, of course, is, well, if you produce more sustainable goods, people are going to want to promote sustainability and simply spend more money on them. You will create the demand by your ethical behavior. While that may be partially true for those that can afford to be more sustainable and ethical, that will not be the majority of consumers in the scarcity-based system we have as they try to desperately save money for their own survival. The vast majority simply do not have the luxury of this kind of behavior. And the same goes for wanting to care more about your employees as a business owner. Pay them more than the average industrial wage. The result is the same. You will lose a competitive edge and lose money in the long run. Why? Because the strategic advantage within capitalist competition is in the abuse of the habitat, the abuse of each other. It is self-regulating tyranny, if you will. And there's really no escape from that. Businesses will simply fail if they do not conform to fundamentally abusive practices, relatively abusive practices, we'll put it that way, in this game of strategic market exploitation. In fact, in recent news, Kroger Corporation here in the United States has been under antitrust scrutiny due to its proposed $25 billion merger with Albertsons, another grocery chain. The Federal Trade Commission filed a lawsuit to block this merger, citing concerns that it would, of course, reduce competition, lead to higher wages, and negatively impact worker wages and benefits, which is always what happens in general. But as I detailed in my prior Substack article called The Competitive Illusion, this is exactly what should be expected of all businesses as they seek to battle competitive forces, which is precisely what Kroger Corporation said in defense, as they are just trying to compete against massive companies like Walmart that also have grocery store elements. I mean, what do you expect? All businesses are moving against competitive balance because that's exactly what you must do, as I'm going to talk about more so in a moment. My main point here relates to this delusion that there are other options in the market economy to be anything but unsustainable, abusive, and monopolistic. The matters of degree don't matter. And it warrants tremendous frustration when you think about it. The causality could not be more clear, and yet rarely we ever hear any system-level conversation amongst NGOs, nonprofits, or the general activist community, the common activist community. And if you do hear people talk about system change, inevitably the subject is immediately countered with the assumption that the only known alternative ever that has ever existed is something called socialism, once again, or communism or Marxism, etc., as if any of those abstracted, subjective ideas exist as formal systems. They do not.